It's my pleasure to introduce our anchor mentor to you, Jenna Cronenberg, who is going to tee this up for you. So welcome.
Thanks, Lisa, and hi everyone, and thank you so much for choosing the nonprofit and social justice cluster for your second session. Um, my name is Jenna. I'm a member of the class of 2013, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'd like to start us off by giving all the mentors a chance to introduce themselves. Just briefly, I know you've had a chance to read some of our bios, but we just want to give you a reminder about how we're engaged in the nonprofit sphere. And then before we jump into question and answer and some other discussion points that we've prepared, we also just want to give like a quick introduction to nonprofit work, what it means for an organization to be a nonprofit, just to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page, because there is a chance that we'll be using like some lingo and phrases that might be unfamiliar to some of you. And that also reminds me to encourage you all to ask questions throughout this. We hope this can be a back and forth conversation. So feel free to raise your hand through Zoom, or if you're more comfortable, you can type in the chat box. And that can be in response to anything one of us has said, or if you have another question that you want us to address at some point. So to kick us off, I have been working full-time in the nonprofit sphere for about 6 years now, but have always been involved, whether extracurricularly, while in school, or volunteer work, in some sort of social justice movement. Right now, I'm engaged with the reproductive health rights and justice movements as a professional fundraiser. When I was a sophomore at Vassar, I never would have thought I would become a fundraiser. I would have said, I hate talking about money and I don't want to ask people for money. So for someone who deals with that sort of anxiety, it was not a linear transition to this line of work, but I'm now really happy with what I do and have a lot of thoughts on the nonprofit world. I went back to school to earn my master's in nonprofit management because I became such a huge nonprofit and fundraising nerd. So with that, I'd like to turn over to another mentor who'd like to introduce themselves. Jen, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go. I'm Jen Dawson, class of 2006, she, her pronouns. So I have been working in the nonprofit world for 14 years as a fundraiser, like Jenna. And some of the other terms you might hear for fundraising are development, philanthropy, advancement in higher education. I've worked in a bunch of different industries or for different causes. So I started out in higher education, then moved to animal welfare. And then for the last 5 years, I've been working for LGBTQI organizations. And like Jenna, I never thought I would be a fundraiser. I was a Girl Scout who couldn't sell Girl Scout cookies, afraid to ask anyone for anything. And I'm a formerly very shy person who sort of conquered that and has now built a career around networking and building relationships with people. So if that's something you're interested in hearing about, please join my breakout room.
Cool. I can go next. Great to see all of you. My name is Noor, class of 2012, focused on political science and French and post-colonial theory with English literature. If you haven't taken a class with Professor Mopedy yet, I hope you do, in poli-sci, life-changing. So at Vassar, my focus really was on disentangling US foreign policy, specifically around surveillance and armed drones. Which at the time were not being spoken about too widely, but my family and where my family still is in Pakistan. So I ended up going back and doing a lot of research on the impacts of US foreign policy. When I left Vassar, I forayed into the world of activism and led a anti-surveillance, anti-drone campaign here in DC that ended up becoming an international campaign with drone survivors in Yemen and Pakistan. and then moved to Amnesty International. So we went from a very grassroots organization to a mega nonprofit with everything that comes along with that, and led our police accountability and criminal justice campaigns there. And when Trump was elected, I ended up moving to a consulting firm that focused on support and sort of nuts and bolts consulting for progressive social justice movements. So a lot of my work looked like campaign strategy, organizing mass direct actions from airports to the Women's March to all sorts of big and small interventions and disruptions. And for the past year, my focus has really been on all things immigration. So working with organizations such as United We Dream and Mi Gente on some work on the border and building up more resilience on the border, and on the Muslim ban, which I'm really glad is repealed, but there's still a lot of work to do. So that's me. And I think the last thing I would just say on Lingo Front, I also sit on a few different boards and fundraising and all the nitty gritty of budget reconciliation and HR and personnel, things that we don't often think about, but are so central to nonprofit social justice careers. So I just want to say, Jenna and Jen, you do really important work that keeps everything moving.
Yasmin, you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Yasmin. I use she, her pronouns, class of 15. I studied a few things while at Vassar, but I think the best umbrella term for all of it is international studies. I'm currently the partnerships manager at a small nonprofit called Beyond the Bomb. We do grassroots organizing to prevent nuclear war, eliminate nuclear weapons, and bring restorative justice to folks who've been impacted by the nuclear system in the United States. So while my focus is kind of, I guess you could say, foreign policy advocacy, it also touches on a lot of the other progressive movements we see today, just because of the health, environmental, human impacts of that, of everything. And so as partnerships manager, I kind of reach out intersectionally to different movements. But I really got my start as a grassroots organizer right out of college, and worked in different organizations spanning from reproductive justice. I worked for some unions, environmental action, ran a voter registration office prior to the 2016 election. So my work's kind of run the gamut. And so happy to talk about that and about the transition from, I guess, some more grassroots work, although there's a few of us who've done this kind of progression on this panel, but the progression from like some very strict local grassroots work up to like a more national or federal policy look and relationship building there.
Hi, I can go. I'm Thomas. I was also class of 2015. I use he, him pronouns. While at Vassar, I studied women's studies. And I will echo the points of like when I was at school or when I was leaving, like I was like, I'm gonna write about dance theater, like was like wildly out there on not what I currently do. But I've become a political fundraiser. And so I have done that work at a national organization. I was at Planned Parenthood's national office for a number of years doing political fundraising for their super PAC and action fund. And so we can talk a little bit about how nonprofit can sort of straddle the political realm and sort of what that work means and how it's similar and different. Since leaving sort of the national organization and doing that work, I've moved in, I did a lot of campaign work for the 2020 cycle. And now I'm working with a group and a project around building workers' rights and funding that work. So excited to talk more.
Hello, everybody. My name is Eli Vargas. I'm class of 2016. My pronouns are he, him, his. At Vassar, I studied international studies, so focused on political science and anthropology of Latin America. And for me, I was super interested in kind of like environmental justice, indigenous rights, and migration, especially as it relates to the Maya peoples of Guatemala, because my family were Maya Quiche. And so I think during Vassar, I had an immigration paralegal internship, did rugby. I was on the editorial board for the MISC. And then immediately after graduating, well, Yasmin recruited me to join her organization and community organize. And so I was on the Boss Arpaio campaign in the 2016 elections to get Sheriff Joe Arpaio out of office as an anti-Trump campaign, and also just a lot of voter registration of non-white people in Arizona with Mi Familia Vota. I did a healthcare advocacy campaign in Nashville at the Tennessee Justice Center, and then consumer advocacy in Wisconsin with the Wisconsin PIRG groups. And now I'm at the ACLU. I'm the program coordinator for a division within the National Political Advocacy Department that does racial justice, Indigenous rights, immigrants' rights, and economic justice. And I lead on campaigns for environmental justice and Indigenous rights. And then I also lead our hiring, liaise between departments. So I know a lot about HR, managing budgets, and how to make a budget. I also look through all the applications for interns and manage the intern postings and manage the interns. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to you all and answer all of your questions.
Thanks, everyone. So as promised, I want to give a little nonprofit 101 introduction. So Jen and then Yasmin are going to talk a little bit about that. And I also hope that the other mentors will jump in if there's anything else that they feel is missing.
So nonprofit is, it's a huge sector of the economy. It's employs about 14% of the workforce in the United States, and, generates many and spends many hundreds of billions of dollars every year. But there's sort of one major difference between the nonprofit. So you might hear the terms nonprofit, not for profit, charity, 501c3, 501c4, or especially international non-governmental organization, or NGO. There are, some differences between those terms, but I'm going to use nonprofit and not-for-profit interchangeably. So the big difference between a nonprofit organization and a for-profit organization is that a for-profit organization exists to provide money to shareholders, to create profit. It doesn't have to create a good product or service. It just has to provide money to shareholders. In contrast, nonprofits have to have a mission that is for the public good. So a benefit to either their membership or the community. There's a bunch of different ways that nonprofits can be incorporated. So in terms of a 501c3, which is named after the section of the tax code that regulates, you can be either a public charity, which is probably what you mostly think of when you think of like the Red Cross or your local animal shelter. And then there's a private foundation, which would be something like the Ford Foundation that exists to give money to other organizations who are doing direct work in advocacy. So 501c3s are, they can be, a wide variety of things. So Vassar College is a nonprofit organization, as are, most higher ed institutions. Houses of worship are 501c3s. Membership orgs, everything from, the tiniest 2-person all volunteer operation. I actually used to, this is embarrassing, volunteer with a bunny rescue that was all volunteer, to things like, Planned Parenthood and the ACLU have actually both 501c3 and 501c4 arms. And I'm going to turn it over to Yasmin to explain what exactly a C4 is.
Great, thanks. So I actually work for a C4 and only a C4. Oftentimes organizations might have both arms. And the reason being is C4 status is talking specifically about your ability to lobby lawmakers directly. And so C3, when you typically think about it in the political sense, they're able to educate. They're able to help educate the public, and then the public can go on and lobby elected officials and take with that knowledge with what they can. But they're not able to endorse candidates during an election cycle. And there's only a limited amount of direct lobbying that they can do versus a C4. You're not tied to the same restrictions that a C3 is, and therefore you are able to endorse candidates during different election cycles as well as do more direct lobbying work. There are a few more distinctions, but I think that those are the key ones. And then my organization, because we are so small, we don't have two arms, but again, a larger organization like a Planned Parenthood will have both a C3 arm and a C4 arm. And that's why if you're subscribed to any email chains, you might get something from Planned Parenthood, and then you might get something from Planned Parenthood Action. And normally that's a pretty key signifier if you're getting something from Action, that that's their C4 arm and they're more, I guess, politically engaged, specifically in lobbying arm. So if anyone has anything else to add on that, please do. But that's kind of a quick summary.
Yeah, I think another important thing to bring up when thinking about the work environments, I think the 6 of us represent a wide range of like the sizes and types of organizations. At the last session, a mentor had talked about, there are some nonprofits that feel very corporate in their structure and their size. And then there are others that are very, very tiny. Like Jen mentioned, maybe a 2-person bunny rescue. So, when you're thinking about the type of workspace you want to be in, the culture, you can find a wide variety of workplaces. Is there anything else anyone wants to add?
I think the only thing I would say is depending on the issue that you're organizing around, something that you might experience in nonprofits that have state or national arms is some really solid coalition work. So, depending on the issue, just speaking around reproductive justice, for instance, like there is, one really solid coalition that people push out some of their campaign work, align on messaging, etc. So that's just something I wanted to bring up. And you might see as you're applying for jobs as well, coalition specific positions that come under coalition management and campaign work in that setting. That is sort of like an infusion of all of these different organizations. It's not common, but we're seeing more and more of it, especially after the past 4 years.
Thanks. So I first want to open up the floor to see if there's any like emergent questions that students have before we dive into anything else. And if not, and remember to, feel free to put it in the chat if someone's talking or raise your hand. I'd like to, pose the prompt to the other mentors in the room. If you haven't already, can you talk a little bit about your path and your choice to be part of this work and maybe connect your experience to Vassar if that's applicable. And feel free to, mentors, jump in whenever you'd like.
Thomas, you can go.
I feel like none of us really wanted to jump. I can jump first. So yeah, I was a women's studies major at Vassar. I didn't graduate with a clear career trajectory, but I did have a clear set of things that I believe in and passionate about and am interested in, right? And so I think for me, graduating in 2015, the 2016 cycle sort of quickly took off. Hillary lost, all that sort of happened, right? And it was sort of I was working on a small nonprofit in New York. And then it was a moment of sort of am I really gonna invest in this career profession, keep growing, get benefits, right? Move to a nonprofit that could pay me a sustainable salary. And so all those things were at play. And that's sort of what pushed me to sort of make the move to moving to Planned Parenthood's national office. So it was a combination of my I would say educational background and mostly how I think, how I feel, sort of all those small p political things that Vassar told me, combined with sort of where we were at in the world and sort of the skill set that I was developing, right? So working in a smaller nonprofit, I sort of got a taste for it, but it was then, I think you reach a point where you're sort of okay, am I just doing this job to survive? So we could talk about survival jobs and what role that plays. But I think I sort of stumbled into it, and then the moment sort of spoke to where we were at and what I was interested in doing. Repro, Planned Parenthood was like going to be at the front of the 2017 pushback. And so that's sort of where I ended up, and then where I worked for a number of years. So it wasn't planned. Like I wasn't in a sophomore career connections around like, I'm going to go into a nonprofit world, but that's sort of how it came about for me.
Yeah, I think a few things were kind of integral from my Vassar experience into ending up where I am now. I think the first was just having the opportunity to study, like, and just like, you know, research and just get really in depth about like so many things. So it's like, yeah, a lot of my family was undocumented. So being able to like kind of study what like the push and pull factors were around migration, like in my family's home country of Guatemala, like indigenous rights, because my family experienced some persecution. And then, you know, just like getting knowledgeable about the system in place, and like realizing that, you know, there's a system in place and you can work to change it. And I think the thing that like really politicized me beyond that was like a moment in my study abroad when I was my program was studying like human rights in South America. And I remember there's this time where this man who had experienced like severe trauma from the state, and you know, like some of his family members were disappeared. He like he was like able to like turn the place where like some of his family members were like tortured and taken, you know, like their human rights were abused, and he was able to like take it and turn it into like an advocacy space and like museum and empowerment, kind of source of empowerment for like his experience. And I remember he was just like staring at us and telling us like, you know, like US foreign policy has like taken a part in this. And he's like, I encourage you to like study the humanities, study like political science, study sociology, like understand your country's history and your role in it, and then like do something about it. So I think the fact that he was able to take such such a traumatic experience and then like stand in a place of just like such power, and like saying all those things with such love to people who like a lot of people in his community would really be loathing and holding accountable for that like it was like extremely inspiring. And then it led me to start community organizing, looking into community organizing and political action, and realizing that like Rigoberta Menchú, who's a Nobel Peace Prize winning community organizer, is from the same tribe as my grandfather. She's Maya Quiche, and how she was able to kind of like work in the Mayan genocide, the Mayan civil war, to advance Maya rights and bring the plight of the Mayan people to the international space. And through that international advocacy, was able to like to make some serious changes. Really inspired me, and like realized that like, you know, like political action and community organizing like is in my blood. And then so then I embarked from there.
Thanks, Eli, for sharing that. When I think about Vassar and sort of what was formative for my journey, I think one thing would be deep relationships with professors whose politics you admire. So for me, Professor Luke Harris and Himadip Mobadi, two very different people, were able to give me that foundation. But for Luke Harris himself, being able to pursue a fellowship. I know Vassar puts out a lot of fellowships, y'all, and you might feel intimidated by them, but just apply and like just talk to your professors and try to get it, you know, try to get their recommendation. But because of him, I was able to get the Ford Fellowship and intern with Professor Kimberly Crenshaw at the African American Policy Forum, which, you know, was everything that somebody who's studying, you know, feminist theory would want. And that taught me so much, both about, you know, my own internalized, you know, white supremacy and anti-Blackness that we all have to unpack, how that showed up at Vassar, and also how that showed up in my like window of politics. But it also taught me, like, this isn't just about like law, this is also about political education and activism, because that's what she does. Like, she leads campaigns based on her legal theory. So definitely don't shy away from those fellowships. I know it can be a bit intimidating to get like a big roster, but keep your eye on it and follow that, and also keep those relationships going. I think the second piece is I entered activism under an Obama administration, right? So for me, that really sharpened my political values. And that's what you all might be entering into right now is like a Democratic administration. And it's much harder to fight against people or fight for something in an environment where even your own friends might not agree with you, right? So that really taught me how to be bold and be disruptive and be able to state my values in a way that was really courageous. And I almost think that's a blessing for, you know, how I was sort of like able to sharpen my own political position and my tools. So don't shy away from like when somebody's like, oh, that's unrealistic, that's never going to work. Because we need that. We actually need people to be able to push those boundaries. So that's my bit.
When at Vassar, I was an independent major. I studied linguistics by combining courses in a variety of departments. But I was always very interested in language development. And part of that was like internalized pressure from family to go into a certain career path. And by the time I got around to my senior year, I realized while I was loving everything I was studying, I was really happy with that path. Career-wise, I really didn't have a clue. And so my first full-time job out of Vassar was actually in the music publishing industry. Something I really knew nothing about. It was an office manager position. I was able to translate my analytical, thinking and writing skills into some pretty basic office work. But, after a while there, I felt like I hadn't really found the industry or the people that I wanted to surround myself with. Kind of going back to the differences between for-profit and nonprofit work, I just felt that being in an industry that was focused on creating capital was not right for me. And so I went back and held a variety of part-time roles and internships, and also made the choice to go back to school and earn my master's in nonprofit management, which if anyone has any questions about that, I'm happy to talk to. After going through it, I have mixed feelings about it, but still glad I did. And while I was there, I focused a lot of my studies on healthcare and philanthropy, and became very interested in supporting movements that were promoting healthcare access for communities who have the least access. And then it was through a Vassar connection that I ended up with my first fundraising gig, which then led me to where I am now, fundraising for a reproductive healthcare advocacy organization. And I think like the work that I did in graduate school and over the past couple of years has kind of solidified my personal philosophy towards this work, which is there's amazing work being done out there, and communities who really know what they need and what needs to be done. And I can take my privilege and my experience to kind of work at the organization almost from the background, and to help like provide funds and help redistribute wealth to make sure that these social movements are getting off the ground and getting the work done. So that's kind of how I ended up here.
Yeah, I think we're split down the middle, maybe, where half of us, we're on this track always. And then I belong to the part that, I was not doing anything related to fundraising or, any sort of nonprofit. I was a Greek major. I was I worked for the Vassar College Encyclopedia. I was basically living at least 500 years in the past, if not 2,500 years in the past. That's pretty common in development, that, it tends to be something that people fall into, and it does attract a lot of liberal arts majors who, might not necessarily have known that it was a career. My freshman year roommate did the phone-a-thon her first semester, and I just thought that was crazy. So like Jenna, I, would not have anticipated becoming a fundraiser. And I kind of fell into it accidentally, and it can be a really good career path. You can work for a cause that you are really passionate about and raise lots of money for it. And like Jenna said, redistribute wealth. And it's also a career field that's pretty, rapidly growing and fairly stable, and usually among the highest paid of all the departments at a nonprofit. So.
Realizing I didn't weigh in and everyone else did, so perhaps I should weigh in. How did I get to where I am? So at Vassar, it was kind of inevitable in a way. Looking back, I'm like, all of these things I did, it all makes sense now. Like, I was really involved with different disruptions on campus, part of different political organizations, was really grassroots organizing without realizing I was grassroots organizing, like getting a club off the ground, like taking feedback, things like that. And then I thought that I had wanted to go to law school, or actually I didn't think so. My mom is in the other room, and literally before this meeting, she's like, "Are you gonna tell them how you're not a lawyer?" And I'm like, "Yes, Mom, I'm going to explain to them how I am not a lawyer." So I'm not a lawyer, but I did contemplate going to law school. My mom still wants me to go to law school, but I thought a good way I knew that I wanted to create change, right? And I knew that law was a way to create change, but also through my Vassar education, both in and outside of the classroom, realized that there were other ways to make change. And so I thought, I've got time, like I don't have to go to law school right out of undergrad. Let me take some time to really take this passion that I have for grassroots organizing and see what happens with that. Long story short, I ended up working for a very horrible organization that burnt me out really badly. I got a lot of experience from them, but I was paid next to nothing and was working 80 or 90 hours a week. And almost quit and almost left the nonprofit sector completely, because I was like, well, if I'm working 90 hours a week, I should just be a consultant and then actually donate. And then on the other side of fundraising, I'm like, and then I'll donate all my money. But then the 2016 election happened, and I was like, oh, I've got this skill set that I hope, like, that I got at Vassar, that I've honed over this last year. Like, let me see what I can do. And basically my old boss reached out and he's like, I know you hate me and you never want to work for me again, but I know these people who are looking for a grassroots organizer, and I think you'd be a really good fit. Just like, please sit down for an informational interview with them. And I was like, fine, I'm already in DC. I guess I'll sit down for this informational interview. And I did. I went and I took a chance on it. And at the end of what turned out to be like a very informative conversation with someone who would be my future boss, he basically turned to me and he goes, can we just count this as your first round interview and set up a second round for next week? And I was like, okay. And I've been with the organization for the past 3.5, going on 4 years now. And basically throughout this whole entire time have realized that while law is a way to influence change, it's not the way that I want to influence change. So that's how I got here.
Thanks, everyone. To the sophomores in the room, has anything we've said inspired any questions, or you'd like to ask us to talk about something else? Kaya?
Yeah, just a quick question. You all have touched on this a little bit, but I'm more curious as to what has led you all to your respective causes, if that makes sense, and how you made that decision. Because frankly, I'm very overwhelmed by the amount of things that I would want to direct advocacy efforts for or towards. So I was wondering if you have any advice in that vein.
Would any other mentor like to go first? I don't want to take up too much space.
I can talk. I haven't really talked about this. I think some of the other mentors have mentioned, but so I started out in higher ed, which I didn't necessarily have a connection to. I wasn't working for Vassar, though someday. My first cause-based organization was the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And who doesn't want to, work to save puppies and kittens? Jenna has one right in front of her on her lap. And we talked about this in the other session, you know, burnout can be really high when you're working for a cause you care about. And it can be also really, really rewarding. So for the past 5 or 6 years, I've worked in LGBTQ organizations, and I was actually pretty initially hesitant to make that jump. I am a lesbian or a gay woman. I came out when I was a sophomore at Vassar, and I didn't necessarily want to be like stereotyped as like the lesbian fundraiser. But when I started working for the organization that I was at, I really found myself as part of a community that I didn't know that I wanted or needed. You know, people used to say to me, like, my straight friends would say, like, oh, you're just, you know, you're one of the cool gays, like, you know, there's nothing gay about you except you date women. And I thought that was a compliment at one point. So that's sort of, I think, where my passion is, and I'm doing a couple different things now, trying to launch some things, a new nonprofit and another venture that hopefully will help the LGBT community. So I think I found my niche. But you can also jump around. You know, I've worked for a really wide variety of causes. Like, you know, maybe there's something you're passionate about now, and you'll work there for a couple of years, and you'll realize that, you know, what you actually want to do is water rights. And there's also an increasing awareness in nonprofit organizations that all these issues are intersectional. Nothing exists in a vacuum. I mean, the LGBTQ community is the most intersectional community in the world. Like, everything is an LGBT issue. Immigration is an LGBT issue. Water access is an LGBT issue. Environmental justice, you know, all these, when the George Floyd protests happened last year, I saw a lot of environmental organizations that I follow come out and say, yeah, racism is an environmental issue. So just because you're working for one organization on one cause doesn't mean that you won't have the opportunity to impact other causes, or you can't make a switch if you find out that, okay, I like working for reproductive justice, but actually I'm more interested in nuclear war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just going off of what Kaya said, or your question, and also what you said, Jen, for me, I felt really burnt out when I moved into the world of human rights, like whether that was focusing on talking to survivors of, you know, US bombs that had lost everything, and being sort of their connector to their target, which is then President Obama, right? Like, it felt like a lot. I felt like I was carrying a lot, and it took a really big emotional toll on me. And in the mega, you know, nonprofit amnesty world as well, I was like, okay, this is what I want to be doing. You know, I'm an international person. I'm not a US citizen at this point. I want to be doing this work and talking about human rights as a whole. But I realized that I was losing my connection to some of the local grassroots struggles that actually are all the things I do after work. So I would say exactly what Jen said. Like, I moved from that to very intentionally wanting to work with multiple movements based on the skills that they need and matching them, right? So if somebody, now when I look at my, like, I'm now in an LLC, I own an LLC as a consulting firm. I like the kinds of things or the kinds of clients I work with is based on what they need and what I'm good at. So I'm like, oh, somebody really wants to map out like a 3-year campaign strategy. It might be about anything. It might be about something I've never touched before, but I know that that's something I'm really good at. Or if it's something around, you know, strategic planning, that's like, it doesn't matter what organization it's for. I know it's something that I'm going to end up caring about because I'm working through that process with those people. So it might be an entry point for you, but also it might just be something that you want to learn about or a skill that you know you're good at. And that will definitely change over time.
Thank you. I want to address Elijah's question in the chat in a second, and I apologize. I'm about to be overtaken by 2 needy cats right now. So if you see whiskers, I'm sorry. I felt a lot of internal pressure to select an issue or a cause, and I felt that if I chose to direct my career towards one, that meant that I didn't care about the others. And I felt really guilty about that. And I've realized that sort of for the very reasons that the other mentors have said, everything is intersectional, right? Everything has to do with each other. And also you don't have to stay in one place. I'm currently looking for a new job. It's time for me to move. And right now at this point in my career, of course, I'm not going to look for a job at an organization that I'm completely at odds with, right? Like I'm not applying to the NRA or anything, but I am looking to move my career path forward. So if I see a position that looks like the qualifications are matched up, it's kind of the next step for me, then I'm going to apply because it feels right for me. So Elijah asked how we decided the locations where we wanted to do our work. And Nora answered in the chat, which is awesome. Thank you.
I can jump in. I'm gonna like weave the two questions together. I wanted to echo what Nora was saying about like issue burnout. I think that like also like the mega nonprofit corporation. I mean, I think like I was working at Planned Parenthood's national office. It was repro, it was Trump, but it also like you reach a point where you're sort of like, if your job and your values and your issues are all one, like I think like you have to be mindful that like your job does not have to define your entire life. And I think in this sector, there's like a really bad habit of like, this is what I do in everything, right? And like that is not sustainable. And like also like it's still a job, like it is still base level, not great. Like it is still like there's like it, so there's that. I also think like working with like brands or names, Planned Parenthood, Amnesty International, ACLU, like you see how the sausage gets made. And like I was a vegetarian at Vassar for a reason, like I think like, so I just like name all that to say like, it is also a process of like adjusting into it and like learning, like, do I actually like this? Is this really how I want to engage with this work? You can still have meaningful impacts in the issues you care about when it's not like your entire like labor and work output. So just saying that, I also then echo like there's power in like moving to consulting work or sort of being able to engage selectively, which is what I've moved into post the Planned Parenthood. So maybe that's a trend. You leave a large national nonprofit that burns you out, and then you sort of find individual, ability to contribute in ways that work. And in terms of where I lived, I mean, I sort of did the Vassar, like, we're all going to move to New York moment, which is where I was at until like becoming my own consultant and sort of then being able to take projects on, which then now there's a pandemic moment, there's all of that. But I would say like nonprofits are everywhere. This issue work is happening everywhere. That's at least where I sort of gravitate towards. I also think sometimes pick the city and then find the work. Like you can work around it depending on what your rubric is. But I sort of was like, I want to be in New York. And then I found sort of the spaces I could work in there. But some people go job and then location.
Yeah, I have an opposite experience, but it's worked out fine. So that first job that I mentioned, where I moved around a lot, we like essentially were given like 2 weeks notice and they're like, new campaign, new city. So I've lived in like Detroit, Tampa, Philly, New York, where I don't even know, like more places. And I was there from anywhere for like 2 to 5 months and was kind of like parachuted in, which I have a lot of qualms with on many levels of if you're actually engaging on grassroots level to build connections, that's like not how you do it. But that's a whole other can of worms for a whole other day. And then the job that I'm in now, originally I was not hired in at the position I'm in. I was originally just hired in as a field organizer. And they told me that I had to be on the West Coast. They were hiring the position for the West Coast and they gave me a choice of 3 different cities. And I kind of picked San Francisco out of a hat. I'd never lived on the West Coast ever, but for me, if I think what Thomas said, like this work is everywhere. And I think for me, one of the joys has been following the work to different places and understanding more of the United States better. As an international studies person, I thought I would be living abroad, and I've actually found a lot of joy in the multiplicity of the United States in a way that I didn't think I would through this work. So I think it's a yes and, like this work exists everywhere. So you can, if you really have your heart set on a city, you'll find this work there, but also like you can let this work take you to some really interesting places you never thought you'd be.
Yeah, I think Yasmin makes some great points that definitely echo with me because we're in the same organization at one time and we're just parachuted in. So I think it was really good to I think I wanted to understand like a lot of different, I guess like political spheres in the US and how how to navigate those. I also didn't want to be in the same place for, a while, because I was, at Vassar, and I was like there for 4 years, and like growing up, I moved a lot. So I think it was like a sense of comfort to move around a lot. But then I think I started thinking about where I'd want to live on a more permanent basis. And like the things I considered were like, do I need a car? And I was like, to live there. And so that ruled out a lot of things, because like basically Trump just pulled us out of the Paris Agreement. And so I was like, I don't want to be, obviously contributing to some climate change. And so I just ruled out like most cities right off the bat. Like I'm from LA, so I was like, I cannot do LA. And then I also evaluated like where my network was best situated. And so that was basically like New York and DC, based on like the factors I already put in. And then I was like, okay, well then like, how do I feel like about each city? And I love both cities, but I realized like in DC, like if I'm gonna be doing a lot of networking, I could just like bike everywhere I wanted, or like it's like just super condensed. So like just traveling around the city was a lot better. And I like kind of like the architecture in DC, and also there's some good Ethiopian food and El Salvadorian food. So that's kind of how I made the decision.
We also have excellent Ethiopian food and Salvadorian food in Los Angeles, as I'm sure you know. I eat a lot of pupusas. I'm like half pupusa. And I also took the bus to work for a year. So I also was part of the Great Vassar migration to New York City after graduation, with probably about 50% of my class and most of my friends. And I was a very begrudging member of that migration. I did not consider myself a city person. I liked gardening. I went to Vassar because it was an arboretum in large part. I still watch farming shows to relax. And I moved because I wanted to go into publishing originally, which is like a story that we don't have enough time for. Thomas is nodding. But after about 6 months of just being really overwhelmed in New York, I started to really like it. And I was there for about 6 years, moved 8 different times. So got to know the subway really, really well. And then I was offered the opportunity to move to Los Angeles, which again, never saw myself living in LA, had only been to California once. And it's just Brooklyn with palm trees. Like LA is great. Yeah, it really is. So yeah, I would echo the advice. You can decide where you want to live and look for a nonprofit. Look for a job. Most of the national nonprofits are headquartered in New York or DC, but there's certainly plenty of things to do in other cities, or even in more rural areas. I know.
These are great questions. Are there any others in the room? Could some of the mentors talk about what like a typical day for them and their job looks like?
Sure. All right. Well, it's lots of Zoom. Before Zoom, it was a lot of moving around every single sort of like co-working space and outdoor mobilization or public space in DC. So it usually starts with a meeting with my fellow partners at my LLC, and then I go through sort of like all of my standing meetings with my clients. So all sorts of check-ins, anything between 30 to 45 minutes for a check-in, and anything from 2 to 3 hour meetings for brainstorming or team meetings where we're working on some sort of planning or some sort of document. I would say that something that has happened over the past few years is that I went from being somebody that slept late and woke up around 9:30 to somebody that wakes up, at 7 and is asleep by 9. It's very boring, but it has definitely helped my like emotional and mental health to be able to do that. Something that is really important to me is having some really firm boundaries. And I think, Thomas, you had alluded to, I mean, I think everyone's alluded to burnout, but because of nonprofit social justice work, people think that you take those issues home with you, or that you always have to be on because something terrible is happening, right? And over the past few years, that has looked like, executive orders and then people not being able to come into this country, right? So it actually has been just that level of rapid response. So something that has been really important to me is setting boundaries, like I put my phone on do not disturb after 6:30 p.m. I put my away message on Slack. God, Slack is awful, but people use it. Put my away message on Slack. If it's away, don't find me. Don't try to talk to me. And I don't check my emails after 7. I would say that for the first few years, that wasn't the case, but it is now. I'm also in part-time grad school, and highly advocate for people taking their time to go to grad school too. I was like, oh, I gotta do it. Now is the time. If I don't do it now, I'm never gonna do it. I took a few GRE classes and I just stopped. So I ended up waiting, and now I'm in part-time public policy school at Georgetown, and it is 2 days a week, and it's also for people that work full-time. So I'm working with people that have, studying with people that have direct experience doing things that I want to learn more about, like program evaluation, like the public policy process, right? That I don't think I would have been able to do had I gone to grad school right away. So I feel like I'm really getting what I needed as opposed to what I thought I would have needed had I gone to grad school right away. So that's sort of my usual day. I do think that if you feel as though your weekends can be work a lot of times, like that's a real thing, but fight for your comp days and don't let the nonprofit complex tell you that you don't deserve a day off if you work a weekend. So a lot of negotiation on that front.
As a fundraiser, no, you're not boring. As a fundraiser, my day also really varies, and I think all nonprofit workers will share that you wear many, many different hats. And something that I know my teammates and I have been trying to advocate more for ourselves is to really stick with what's in our job description, but it is common sometimes to find smaller organizations understaffed and needing to pick up the work where you need. And actually, that's why I'm currently in a job search. I am running my department, and my title and compensation does not reflect that, and my organization is not willing to make that change. So I'm choosing to make that switch. But like on a daily basis, I do a variety of things. A lot of administrative. Our fundraising strategy is very data driven. So I'm doing a lot of data analysis on our fundraising results and practices. And I'm also meeting regularly with our program staff to make sure that I'm up to date in the work that they're doing and that our messaging is aligned with theirs. I think Noor mentioned at the start of this that coalition building is becoming more and more important, and especially in the repro movement. Making sure that our messages are aligned across all channels is really important, even also from a fundraising perspective. And then fundraising, varies from writing, from actual meetings with donors, which, contrary to popular belief, the asking for money part is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. As I know Jen and everyone else can attest to. A lot of my work has to do with relationship building and understanding why donors are listening to them and understanding why they've come to this work and why they're choosing to make an investment in this work, which I really love hearing lots of stories. I would say I'm very lucky. The majority of my interactions with donors are really positive, and they want to have a positive impact, and they want to hear about what we need, which is so unheard of in a lot of funder situations. So that's really nice. I particularly work with individual giving. So I'm working with individuals or family foundations that are looking to give to causes, but there are other fundraisers who will work in institutional giving, who develop relationships with foundations. Like you've heard some of the big ones, you might have heard of like Ford Foundation, and those are big grant making organizations that the fundraising with them is a little bit different. So that's what I'm doing day to day. And, you know, I want to talk a little bit also about that boundary setting and culture that has been really important to me. I have only worked for smaller to mid-sized nonprofits, and I really love the flexibility and trust that comes with that. My organization was mostly remote before COVID, and so I was very used to Zoom already. And I loved that if I had to make a doctor's appointment during the day or run an errand, I could do that because my colleagues trusted me to still get my work done. And I know that in more of a bigger corporate setting, you might not get that sort of flexibility. So in like looking for a workplace and you know, how I want to do my work, those sort of things play into it.
I just want to sort of echo the points around compensation, just to say that like nonprofit does not mean you should not get paid. And it doesn't mean that you should not get paid a competitive salary and have benefits and have retirement. I mean, as we keep name dropping the Ford Foundation, that 13% employer match, like crazy benefits over there. But I'm just saying is that like you are doing labor and you should get paid for it. There's a ton of money in the non-for-profit sector. There's a ton of money in tax shelters, in family foundations, in donor advice funds. Like, I'm sorry, if your organization or your management says we don't have the money, like as from the development fundraising end, that's not the case. So you know what I'm saying? Like if you don't raise enough to pay your staff, leave the organization. So I just say that to say that like it is really hard because okay, so this I'm more critical in this session than the first session, but the values being used against you of like, you don't support this mission, you know, so your commitment to the mission or to the value add or to whatever you're trying to do has nothing to do, like you wanting to get paid an equal salary doesn't mean like you're taking money away from whatever programs are, like it doesn't work like that. So I really think that like, it's a hard thing to do. Management will always try to twist it, but like you should get paid for your work, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit. It just like, it's a non-negotiable, but it's a double-edged sword if you're on a mission-driven organization.
And
Yeah,
some, oh, go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of nonprofits like try to have this like martyrdom kind of syndrome. And I feel like that's very toxic because it kind of like it's like a way to manipulate you a lot of ways to work more hours or take less pay, right? Because then you're like, if I'm taking less pay, then like, you know, it can go towards more programming or different things like that. One like in reality, it's like when people have more hours to themselves or are better able to take care of their mental health, like they're going to be more productive and you're going to be more creative and you're going to bring more energy to the workplace. So it's and yeah, I think it's very important to, you know, take care of yourself, even if you're working to take care of other people, because I think it's very important that, you know, like you don't have to stay in the movement forever, right? But if your heart is set on it and then you just can't avoid the burnout, then, you know, you're not going to be able to stay in the movement doing the work that you want. So I think it's important to take care of yourself. And also another thing is like, yeah, you don't have to be doing the nonprofit work forever, right? You can go in and out as you need to. I know some people just couldn't handle it like after a few years of like the Trump administration. So my coworkers are saying if like Trump's reelected, like I'm taking like a cushy job until, you know, I can get like, you know, like feeling back to normal. So I think it's important to be very aware of the culture that you're entering and like if they're trying to push, you know, the martyrdom syndrome and self-sacrifice. You have to be your own best advocate in advocacy and nonprofit work.
Nora mentioned this, so I was just going to say a lot of workplaces, especially in progressive nonprofit settings, are starting to unionize, and you can find that really easily. So if that's something which I advocate looking for, like you can see if a workplace is unionized and exactly what the compensation is and et cetera, and what that means. The other thing on advocating for yourself, and I think this even goes with internships sometimes, like even if it's an unpaid internship, like when you're doing interviews, like I think you need to start advocating for yourself from day one. So my interview, or that informational interview that turned into a first round interview, I think in the second round interview that I had, I was very precise in the questions I asked about culture, about expectations, about like, yeah, can I turn my Slack off after 6 p.m.? Am I expected to keep this on? I'm going to be a person of color on an all white staff. Have you experienced that before? What will, like, how does that mission, like, this is what I bring to the table for this. So to be clear, like, nuclear weapons and nuclear policy is not like my top line issue, but I work in this because it allows me to not be burnt out on the other issues I care about. It's something that I can step away from. I think it's still important. I think it definitely plays into everything else, but it's not my top line issue. And I was very clear. I'm like, I'm going to bring all those other things I care about racial justice, about gender equity, about wealth redistribution. Like, I'm going to bring all of that to this. Is that okay? And like really advocated for how I would approach the role. That way, that expectation, when they hired me, they knew exactly who they were getting, and I knew exactly what I could expect from them. And I think that we're often afraid during an interview to do that because we don't want to turn off a potential employer. But the way that I think we should approach it is, if we're turning them off from the questions we're asking or the way we would approach a job, do we want to be working there in the first place? And I understand not everyone's in that position, but it's a good way, I think, to approach interviews and jobs.
Yeah, interviewing should absolutely be a two-way street. Just like Yasmin said, you know, you're not just trying to impress the organization and get them to hire you. You're also trying to figure out if it's somewhere you want to be. I have asked for more money or more vacation time or whatever I want, whatever makes sense at virtually every job. Not always successfully. I didn't always get the extra money or the extra vacation time, though I have a good track record. And I think it's important, especially if you, there are all these statistics about how that breaks down along gender lines that women, tend to negotiate less than men. And I'm sure that breaks down along racial and other identity lines too. There's also, a growing movement in the nonprofit world about equity and transparency. So there's been a push to state salary ranges up front in job descriptions, which is really helpful. Glassdoor is also a great resource for looking at salaries, especially based on your region, though it can be a little harder with smaller organizations to find people willing that have shared their salary there. And then in some states, California included, and some other states are following suit. They can't ask you legally about your salary history, which used to be a very common question on applications. What are you earning now? What's your salary history? And then they would base your pay on what you used to make, which is a great way to pay women and people of color and people of different abilities less, because they're entering the workforce at a lower rate. So now it's not only illegal for them to ask that question, they actually have to provide you a range for the position if you ask. So yeah, there's a lot of hesitancy in our culture around talking about money or asking about money, or it's not okay to ask about salary or to ask someone for money. And being a fundraiser and asking people for money for a living has helped me get over some of that. But don't be afraid to really do the research and figure out what you're worth and ask for more. And also max out your retirement immediately. The day that you are eligible, sign up for that plan and max it out. I signed up when I was 24, and universities have great, like 10% matching. And I have, a lot more money in the bank now than I ever thought I've had, though unfortunately none of it's in GameStop.
Also, talking about compensation, or Jenna, did you have?
No.
So something I think with nonprofits, another thing to look at would be like your total package of compensation. So also looking at that retirement. So my organization, it's not even a match, it's a 10% like given to my retirement. So I don't, like, whatever I put in and then an additional 10% regardless of if I'm contributing, right? And so while I might be making less salary-wise than especially my friends in the for-profit sector, but even some of my friends in the nonprofit sector, like that with some other benefits, like I've got an extremely generous vacation package. And that to me makes a lot of sense for my life right now. And so I think when you think about compensation, it's important to look at factors of like where you are in your life, what your saving goals are, like what you want to accomplish, and then taking that as a holistic thing, because sometimes the initial number can be a bit scary, and then you take it all into consideration and you're like, actually, this makes a lot of sense for where I am at right now, or what I can do right now. So I would just encourage you to look beyond just this. Obviously negotiate the heck out of your salary, but like beyond that, look at what else they are offering.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just two sort of recent trends that I actually see more in grassroots organizations with smaller staffs than large organizations is wellness stipends, remote working stipends to sort of like pay for your phone. If they're going to be the ones calling you all the time, maybe they can help like chip into the phone bill, right? Or the internet. Another piece would be professional development. Something that I absolutely have loved is tapping into that. I'm like, actually, I will go to 2 trainings a year, and the organization's going to pay for that because it's all going to come back and help them. So you definitely want to ask those questions too, is like, what are professional development opportunities? What are personal health or like wellness opportunities as well? And of course, all those things like retirement funds. I think the last thing that I would say, and just some of my thoughts that are coming around this conversation is, oftentimes, as consumers of all the things that are happening in the world, we see some of these big brands or like large organizations dominate the news. I found my most fulfilling experiences to be in those staff, the staffs that are like smaller and mid-sized, because you learn how to do a little bit of everything that then helps you later down the line, and really teaches you some incredible skills, and connects you to people that move onwards and upwards. So just wanted to say, don't let those shiny brands distract you or pull you in too deep.
Thanks, everyone. These are really helpful, and I'm so glad everyone's been open and honest with their own experiences. So at this point, we're going to move into our breakout groups that Lisa's created, and feel free to move around among the breakout groups. We will not be offended if you leave our groups. We understand that we're all bringing different experiences to the table, and you might want to talk to one of us about something else. Totally fine. Lisa, is there anything else?
I think that really covers it. We'll be in the breakout room for up to 20 minutes. If you're having any issues, just come back into the main room and I'll be there to help you move around. But I wanted simply to thank all of our fabulous panelists for a really provocative and interesting discussion. I certainly learned a lot of new things. It was fascinating to listen. And I hope the same was true for all the students. So thank you so much. So we'll go into the rooms now. There are going to be 3 people per room, so you really have more of a chance to talk, like you would be if you were in the hallway after a panel was over and wanted to just have some informal time with people. I also encourage you to consider coming back tomorrow for the networking reception to meet one-on-one, not only with members of this group, but also many of the other mentors from the different clusters that you didn't have a chance to connect with. So any questions before we go to that next step here? Cool. All right. Please accept your breakout room and we'll see you there.